clock struck 11:59 p.m., and the quiet suburban neighborhood lay shrouded in a blanket of silence. Most of the homes were dark, their occupants lost in dreams, but the house at the end of Sycamore Street stood out. It was a modest two-story with peeling white paint and a flickering porch light, the only source of illumination in the cul-de-sac. Inside, Clara Hughes sat alone on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, scrolling through her phone. She loved these late-night moments of solitude. Her husband was out of town and the kids were fast asleep upstairs. Everything was perfectly still, or so she thought. A sharp, unexpected knock shattered the tranquility. Clara froze, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. It wasn't the kind of knock one would expect from a neighbor dropping by or a delivery driver at the wrong address. It was deliberate, loud, and eerily slow, as if the knocker knew they were interrupting her peace. Knock. 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 She glanced at the clock. Midnight. Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted toward the front door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the idea of a stranger knocking at this hour sent a chill down her spine. Her immediate thought was to ignore it. Maybe they would go away. But then the knock came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 Clara set her phone down and rose from the couch, her movements cautious. She approached the door, peering through the peephole. The porch light flickered ominously, casting shifting shadows, but no one was there. The empty porch seemed to mock her. Her stomach churned and she hesitated, her hand resting on the deadbolt. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. "Help me." Her heart dropped. It was the voice of a child. She pressed her ear closer, straining to hear more, but the voice didn't repeat itself. Instead, there was silence. Clara's maternal instincts kicked in, battling her fear. What if a child was truly in danger? What if someone needed her help? She unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The porch light flickered one final time before going out completely, plunging her surroundings into darkness. Clara's breath quickened. She squinted into the night but saw nothing. No child, no shadow, no movement. The street was eerily empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. Just as she began to close the door, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A small figure darted across the yard and disappeared behind the hedges. It was quick, almost too quick to process. Clara's grip on the door tightened. "Wait. Come back," she shouted, stepping onto the porch. The cold night air bit at her skin. She scanned the yard, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the distant street lamp. The figure was gone. But then the whisper came again, this time closer. "Help me." Clara's gaze snapped to the hedges, where the voice seemed to originate. She debated whether to step off the porch and investigate. Her rational mind screamed at her to go back inside, lock the door and call the police. But her feet moved on their own, driven by the desperation in that small, pleading voice. As she approached the hedges, she noticed something lying on the ground. It was a doll, old and tattered, with one glassy eye missing. She bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling. The doll felt unnervingly cold, as if it had been sitting in the frost for hours. Suddenly, a noise behind her made her whirl around. A soft rustling, like leaves being dragged across the pavement. But there was no wind. She clutched the doll tightly, her eyes darting around the yard. The street lamp flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to creep closer with every pulse of light. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. A faint giggle echoed through the night, sending shivers down her spine. It was high-pitched and unnatural, more like the sound of something trying to imitate a child's laugh than an actual child. Clara backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She retreated to the porch, her fingers fumbling to unlock her phone. Before she could dial, the porch light flared back on, and there, standing at the edge of the light's reach, was a little girl. Her head was bowed, her long hair obscuring her face. She wore a pale dress that looked torn and dirty, as though she'd been wandering for days. Clara's voice caught in her throat. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised her head slowly, revealing her face. Clara's blood ran cold. The girl's eyes were entirely black, void of any emotion or humanity, and her mouth twisted into a chilling smile that seemed far too wide for her small face. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the girl whispered. Clara stumbled backward, dropping the doll. She turned and rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking every bolt. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps. She pressed her back against the door, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be her imagination. But then the knocking started again. Knock. 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 It was louder now, more insistent. Clara's phone vibrated in her hand and she nearly dropped it. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. Hesitating for only a moment, she answered, her voice shaking. "Hello. Why did you leave me outside?" the voice on the other end said. It was the little girl. Clara's scream echoed through the house as the line went dead. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if dozens of fists were pounding on the door at once. The entire house seemed to vibrate with the force of it. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Clara's breaths came in ragged gasps. She didn't dare move from her spot against the door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, summoning what little courage she had left, she peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. But as she turned away, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. Written on the wall in jagged, dark letters were the words, "Let me in." The silence after the chaos was deafening. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, hoping to block out the sound of her own labored breathing. Her heart pounded relentlessly as she stood frozen in the entryway. She couldn't bring herself to look at the words again, though they burned in her mind. Let me in. Clara needed answers. She hurried into the living room and grabbed her laptop, fingers trembling as she opened a browser. Her first instinct was to search for paranormal encounters, but she shook her head. That would lead her down a rabbit hole she wasn't ready for. Instead, she typed, "Strange knocks at night." The results were a mix of mundane explanations, pranks, wind, animals, and eerie tales of ghostly apparitions and curses. One link caught her eye, the Midnight Caller. She clicked on it and a poorly designed web page loaded, filled with testimonials of people who'd experienced similar events. They described hearing knocks at their doors, finding strange objects, and seeing a figure, always a little girl. Clara's blood ran cold as she scrolled. Each story ended the same way. The person disappeared, their home left abandoned. The last entry was dated 2 years ago, and it simply read, "Don't let her in." A loud crash from upstairs made Clara jump. She slammed the laptop shut and bolted to the stairs, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "Katie? Michael?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of a nightlight coming from her daughter Katie's room. Clara pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. Clara's pulse quickened as she stared at Katie's empty bed, the soft glow of the unicorn-shaped nightlight casting shifting shadows across the walls. The covers were neatly tucked in as if Katie hadn't even been there. Her heart sank as she whispered, "Katie? Michael?" The silence in the house felt oppressive, as though it were alive and breathing around her. She stepped cautiously into the room, her hand instinctively brushing over the bed to confirm what her eyes were seeing. The sheets were cold, untouched. A pang of fear clawed at her chest. Clara turned to the closet, the door slightly ajar. Her breath hitched as she reached out, fingers trembling, and swung it open. Nothing. Just Katie's dresses and a clutter of toys. But then she noticed it. A single handprint, smudged and small, pressed onto the inside of the closet door. The print was too high for Katie to have left it, and it seemed to shimmer faintly in the glow of the nightlight. A soft tapping sound broke the silence. Clara spun around, her eyes scanning the room. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, as though something was rapping on glass. Her gaze snapped to the window. Katie stood outside, barefoot, on the slanted roof. Her face was turned away, her long hair obscuring her features, and her small hands tapped lightly against the window pane. "Katie!" Clara gasped, rushing toward the window. "What are you doing out there? Come inside." She fumbled with the latch, her fingers slippery with sweat, and yanked the window open. The icy night air rushed in, making her shiver. Clara leaned out, reaching for her daughter. "Katie, give me your hand." Katie's head turned slowly, too slowly, until her face came into view. Clara froze. It wasn't Katie. The figure grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. Its eyes were two empty voids, staring directly into Clara's soul. The thing tilted its head as if amused by her terror, then whispered in a distorted, childlike voice, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Clara stumbled backward, tripping over the bed and landing hard on the floor. When she looked up, the figure was gone and the window was closed, the latch locked as though it had never been opened. Her body shook as she scrambled to her feet and bolted down the hallway to Michael's room. She flung the door open, praying he was still there. His bed was empty too. The sheets were twisted as though he had been dragged out of bed in a hurry. A low, guttural growl echoed from the hallway behind her. Clara spun around, pressing her back against the doorframe. The air seemed heavier, darker, and the shadows on the walls began to shift unnaturally, crawling like living things. "Michael? Katie?" she whispered hoarsely, tears streaming down her face. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of whispers. They overlapped, unintelligible but filled with malice, and seemed to come from every direction at once. Clara clutched her chest, trying to steady her breathing, and forced herself to move. She raced down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden steps. She needed to call for help. She reached the living room and grabbed her phone, but the screen was black. No matter how many times she pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. She rushed to the landline, but the line was dead, emitting only static. A loud thud came from the kitchen, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Clara hesitated, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to move toward the noise. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the refrigerator door, which stood slightly open. Broken glass littered the floor, and the air was icy cold, colder than it should have been even with the fridge open. "Katie? Michael?" Clara called out again, her voice trembling. The refrigerator door creaked open further, revealing a figure crouched inside. It was small, hunched, and its limbs seemed too long for its body. Slowly, it turned its head toward her, its black, hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Found you," it rasped, its voice a grotesque mix of a child's giggle and a growl. Clara screamed and stumbled backward, slipping on the cold tile. She scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the front door, her mind consumed with one thought: escape. She yanked at the locks, her fingers fumbling in her panic, and flung the door open. But instead of the familiar street, she was met with an endless void of darkness. The porch, the yard, the street, everything was gone. She stepped back into the house, slamming the door shut, her breathing ragged. The whispers returned, louder now, and she could feel the presence of something behind her. Slowly she turned around. The living room was no longer her living room. The furniture was gone, replaced by old, rotting wooden chairs and a table covered in cobwebs. The walls were cracked and oozing a dark, sticky substance. The air smelled of decay and mildew. In the center of the room stood the little girl. Her head was bowed, her hair obscuring her face once again. "Where are my children?" Clara demanded, her voice breaking. The girl raised her head, her black eyes filled with a sinister glee. "They're with me now," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Clara's knees gave out and she collapsed to the floor. "Please, let them go. Take me instead." The girl tilted her head, considering the offer. "But you invited me in," she whispered. "And once you invite me, I never leave." The shadows on the walls surged forward, engulfing Clara as her screams echoed into the void. And then silence. The house at the end of Sycamore Street stood dark and empty, its peeling paint and flickering porch light a silent testament to what had transpired within. Neighbors would later say they heard strange noises that night, but no one dared investigate. The Hughes family was never seen again. But sometimes, late at night, a soft knock can be heard at the door. And a child's voice whispers, "Help me." Clara's mind raced as she bolted down the stairs. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the sound echoing in her ears. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting and twisting as if mocking her fear. She clutched the strange diary tightly, its leather cover cold and damp, and flipped through the brittle pages while pacing. The cryptic symbols etched into its yellowed sheets seemed to writhe, alive with a menacing energy. She stopped abruptly as one symbol caught her eye, a crescent moon surrounded by jagged lines, eerily similar to the drawing etched into the wall upstairs. Beneath it, in faded but legible ink, was a single phrase written in spidery handwriting. "The shadow waits for the door to open." Clara slammed the diary shut, her chest tightening. A deep, guttural creak resonated from the front door. She spun around, her breath catching as she saw the deadbolt slowly twisting on its own. No, 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 she whispered, rushing to the door. She grabbed the lock, trying to hold it in place, but it was ice cold, burning her fingers. The knocking started again, deafening this time, shaking the entire frame. Knock. 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 The diary slipped from her hand, landing with a thud. As it hit the ground, the pages flew open, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive presence. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of eyes watching her from the darkness just beyond the porch. The little girl's voice rang out, soft but filled with venom. You shouldn't have ignored me. Clara stumbled backward, her legs giving out as the voice grew louder, overlapping with itself in an unholy cacophony. You shouldn't have ignored me. You shouldn't have ignored me. Desperate, Clara scrambled toward the living room, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with her phone. She tried to call for help, but the screen flickered and died, the battery inexplicably drained. The lights overhead buzzed and dimmed, plunging the house into near darkness. Suddenly the whispers started. They came from every direction, low, guttural murmurs, spoken in a language Clara didn't understand. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did little to block the invasive sounds. The shadows around her thickened, crawling along the walls and ceiling like living tendrils. Then a voice spoke clearly above the rest, resonating deep within her mind. Let me in, Clara. She gasped. How do you know my name? She cried, her voice cracking. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure standing just beyond the threshold of the front door. It was the little girl, but her form was distorted, her limbs unnaturally elongated, her head tilted at an impossible angle. The empty black pits where her eyes should have been stared into Clara's soul. You invited me when you opened the door, the girl said, her smile widening grotesquely. And now I am part of you. Clara's vision blurred as a sharp pain erupted in her chest. She clutched at her heart, feeling an icy chill spreading through her veins. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows slithered closer, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. In a final act of defiance, Clara grabbed the diary from the floor and flipped to the last page. Her eyes skimmed the text, desperate for some clue, some way to fight back. There, scrawled in frantic handwriting, were the words, "Break the mirror to sever the bond." Clara's gaze darted to the ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. The shadows seemed to recoil slightly as if aware of her intent. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she staggered to her feet and grabbed the poker from the hearth. With a primal scream, she swung it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 glittering shards. A deafening wail filled the house, the sound of countless voices screaming in unison. The shadows convulsed, writhing violently before dissipating into thin air. The little girl's distorted figure flickered like a dying flame before vanishing entirely. Silence. Clara collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The oppressive weight lifted and the house seemed to breathe again. The lights flickered back on and the air lost its icy chill. But the words etched into the wall upstairs remained, a haunting reminder of what had transpired. As dawn broke, Clara sat in the living room, staring blankly at the shards of the shattered mirror. The diary lay open on the coffee table, its pages blank, as if whatever malevolent force it contained had been exorcised. But deep in her heart, Clara knew this wasn't over. Some doors once opened could never truly be closed. The morning sunlight crept through the curtains, warm and golden, but it offered Clara no comfort. The events of the night before replayed in her mind like a twisted reel of memories. She swept up the shattered glass from the mirror, her movements slow and mechanical. Every step felt heavy, as if the house itself bore the weight of what had happened. Clara's phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from her friend Emily. "Emily, you okay? Haven't heard from you since yesterday." Clara stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. She couldn't bring herself to explain what had happened, so she typed a simple reply. "Clara, I'm fine. Let's talk later." The diary sat on the coffee table, innocuous and silent now. She had thought it was empty after the mirror shattered, but as she walked past it, something caught her eye, a new page written in fresh ink. Her stomach dropped as she picked it up and read. "The first door is closed, but the house has many others. They're watching. Always watching." A chill ran down her spine. She turned the diary over, searching for answers, but there was nothing else, just that ominous warning. She tossed it onto the table, breathing heavily. "I'm not playing your games anymore," she whispered. Determined to leave the house and never return, Clara packed a small bag with essentials. She avoided looking into the empty space where the mirror once hung and ignored the strange creaks and groans of the floorboards. With each step toward the front door, a sense of unease grew, like an unseen force was trying to hold her back. As she reached for the doorknob, a faint voice whispered, "You can't leave." She froze. Her hand hovered over the knob, trembling. She shook her head violently, muttering, "No, this isn't real." With a burst of adrenaline, she yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch. The fresh air hit her like a wave, but the relief was short-lived. The world outside wasn't as she had left it. The once familiar neighborhood was shrouded in mist, and the houses seemed distorted, their edges blurred like an unfinished painting. The streetlights flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that danced and twisted. She turned back to the house, but it looked different. Older, darker, as though it had been abandoned for decades. Her heart raced. "This isn't real. This isn't real," she whispered, clutching her bag tightly. Suddenly, the little girl's voice rang out, louder than ever. "You can't leave, Clara." "Not yet." Clara spun around to see the child standing at the edge of the porch, her form flickering between the innocent girl she had first seen and the grotesque, elongated shadow from the night before. Behind her, the mist swirled, forming vague shapes. Faces, eyes, hands reaching out. "Why are you doing this?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The girl tilted her head, her black, empty eyes locking onto Clara's. "It's not what I want," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "It's what they want. The house chose you, Claire. You opened the door." Claire's mind reeled. She backed away, her foot brushing against something on the porch. Looking down, she saw it was the diary. She didn't remember bringing it outside, but there it was, open to another freshly written page. "The only way out is through." The words burned into her mind. She clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. "No. I'm done playing your games. If the house wants me, it can come and get me." With that, Clara hurled the diary into the mist. It vanished instantly as though the fog swallowed it whole. The world around her began to ripple, the air thickening like water. The shadows pressed closer, the little girl's smile widening impossibly as she stepped forward. "You'll come back," the girl said softly. "They all do." Clara turned and ran, her feet pounding against the ground. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The mist clung to her, cold and suffocating, but she pushed through, her heart thundering in her chest. As she ran, the world shifted around her. The distorted neighborhood gave way to a dense forest, its towering trees twisted and unnatural. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. Just as she thought she couldn't run any farther, she stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood another house, identical to the one she had just left. Her blood turned to ice as she realized it wasn't a different house at all. It was the same one waiting for her. The front door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Clara fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. There was no escape. The diary's words echoed in her mind. "The only way out is through." She stood slowly, her resolve hardening. If the house wanted her, she would face it on her own terms. With one final deep breath, she stepped through the door and disappeared into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her, and the house fell silent once more, waiting for its next visitor.